Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about glazing. First thing we want to make sure is that we have our bisque pieces and they're nice and clean. You always want to make sure that your pieces are bisqued before we glaze them. We cannot glaze any unbisqued pieces. So your pieces should have changed color, hard enough and fired enough that you can hear a nice ting. And now we're going to clean those off first. I recommend that if you can, and you have your pieces at home, to make sure that maybe spend a little time cleaning them there, just because that will cut down on your drying time and you will have more time during your glaze appointment in order to glaze your pieces. At any rate, you don't really need to do like a deep scrub or a soak on these. We just want to make sure that we knock the dust off of there. So I'm just going to run the water a little bit, take my piece, just swirl a little water there, swirl a little water there. We're going to let those dry. So we want to make sure that those are no longer shiny and wet when we put them in the glaze bucket. And I would recommend that if you have a lot of pieces to glaze and rinse, just rinse them all off at the same time and let them dry. That way you can glaze the first one while the other ones are drying. Okay? We're going to let those sit. So kind of depending on the weather, that will kind of determine how long these take to dry. You can see these are already drying pretty fast though. You want to make sure that there aren't any shiny spots. There aren't a lot of wet spots, because when we dip it in the glaze, if there's too much water in there, it'll be oversaturated with liquid and your glaze won't be absorbed into the bisque. And it can also drip down your piece and be really unpleasant to look at. So we don't want that. So make sure that your piece is nice and dull. You can already see this changing color back to the bisque piece, back to the bisque color that was originally. Okay, this one is drying as well. Okay, so those are starting to look really good. So the other thing you want to make sure is you don't get any kind of oily marks. If you have any lotion on your finger or a cloth that's not quite clean or clay, we don't want any dust or oil on your bisque pieces before you glaze them, because that can cause the glaze to crawl, which means that the glaze does not adhere properly to your piece in the kiln, and it will start to resist the glaze and that seal between the glaze and the bisque. And then you get these kind of characteristic looks on your pieces that show big bald patches. So we don't want that. So make sure these are nice and clean. If you're going to pack them from home, make sure you've got a clean piece of plastic. Right after you wash it, you can just wrap that up. That way dust won't settle on again. Then you'll be able to take it out and glaze it as soon as you get here. Okay, so looking here at a piece that was already fired in the studio, this is very characteristic of a glaze that has crawled. So this person did not wash the dust off of their piece, or they had some oil on their hands when they were glazing. Big culprit of this is like eating some lunch or something and coming by and touching your pieces and getting a layer of oil or lanolin or food oil or dust or anything on there. That will cause the glaze to delaminate off of your piece while it's firing, and you get these big bald patches. So that's what we mean when we talk about crawling. There's these big bald patches here. They're not impossible to fix, but they can be really irritating. It does take another firing in order to even those out again with more glaze. So we want to try to get this right the first time. So make sure that your pieces are nice and clean before we glaze those. If they've been sitting up here at the studio, they definitely are dusty. A lot of the pieces have been sitting outside or exposed to outside air and a lot of dust in the studio. So you want to make sure you get all of that rinsed off. Okay, so our pieces are almost ready to go here. Okay, so hopefully you can see this. We've got our 5-gallon buckets full of glaze here. And we've got black, peacock, titania blue, clear, and white. And most of these will kind of mostly be within this range. For this process, we don't want to get too hung up in what they're going to exactly look like. This is kind of a spontaneous process, and they're going to look different no matter where they are in the kiln or how thick the glaze is. It's going to kind of be affected by the clay that it's on. There's a lot of different factors. So don't get too hung up, and kind of use some pieces at first that you're not super hung up on, and that way you can experiment with how the glazes look and get some results really quickly. So I am going to glaze this mug here. Okay. So we want to remember that we don't want any glaze on the bottom. Not sure what that is, just a little weird bunch of stuff. We want to make sure that we don't have any glaze on the bottom or any place that that piece is going to touch when we put that in the kiln. We also want to make sure that we leave a space of at least 1/4 of an inch. So when the glaze gets liquid in the kiln and it drifts down a little bit, we leave enough space there that if there is a drip, it will drip down onto the empty space that we left there instead of right down onto the edge there and onto the kiln shelf. Okay, so these glazes are pretty fresh. Let's take a look here. Sometimes they get a little skin of water on the top here, which you can kind of see. So we want to make sure that we take a clean stick, if we need to, just kind of stir those up. These are nice and fresh and thick. Okay, so we don't need to put a lot of glaze on here. If you've used any kind of brushing glaze, you know that you have to do kind of 3 layers. When you dip it, you don't need to have it that. Okay, so we're going to take our piece here, and we're going to glaze the inside first. Okay, so I'm going to glaze the inside first here. This is a black glaze. I'm going to use that on the inside. I'm going to take a clean container and bring one from home, like a yogurt container. Just scoop up a little of the glaze here. And I'm going to pour that inside. I'm going to quickly scoop it around and then pour that out. You can see I barely left that in there for like a second. Okay, so take that from the outside, and this is why we glaze the inside first. You can control the amount that we want to have in there and shake out the excess. Okay. Okay, so we're going to let that dry a little bit. So we don't want to put wet glaze that's fresh right into another bucket of a different color, because the wet glaze that is just drying on your piece can actually be washed off by the liquid glaze in another jar, and that way we muddy up the colors if we transfer a lot of the colors from bucket to bucket. So if you're going to use more than one color on a piece, make sure that this is dry, and you'll know it's dry because it's turning that chalky color. And the surface will no longer be shiny. Okay, so you can see it's drying out in the nice sun here. So make sure you also clean your utensils, and don't use the stick that you use to stir one glaze to stir another glaze. Okay, so we're going to wash those off. We're going to use different utensils if we move to a different color glaze. Okay. So for this piece here, I've got some slip decoration on here. It's going to be 2 contrasting colors, even though you don't see that very much now. It will look different when it comes out in the reduction firing. The slightly darker color will be a lot darker, and that should give me more contrast on my design. So for this, I don't want to cover up my design on the outside, so I'm going to use some peacock on the inside, and the outside I'm going to do clear. And that clear will just allow my clay to shine through, but also when the clay is darkened in reduction, it's also going to show that. Okay, so we're going to glaze our second mug here. Okay, so I'm going to do the inside peacock blue. I'm going to do the outside clear. So I'm going to start with that blue on the inside. I've got my first mug drying to the side here. Okay. Come down here. Peacock blue. Blue. The raw material that makes the blue is actually a pinkish color, but it's going to fire blue when we fire the kiln. Fill that up a little bit. Pour that on the inside. Roll that around in there. Doesn't quite get it to the top. Just go ahead. Roll that out. Turn that over. Shake it to drip out the excess there. Okay. See, we've got a little glaze on the outside, and that's actually kind of good because we can show how to clean that up. So take a large sponge here. Glaze our second mug here. Okay, so I'm going to do the inside peacock blue. I'm going to do the outside clear. So I'm going to start with that blue on the inside. I've got my first mug drying to the side here. Okay. Down here. Our peacock blue, I'm going to go ahead and stir that up. You can see that doesn't really look blue because the raw material that makes the blue is actually a pinkish color, but it's going to fire blue when we fire it in the kiln. Okay. So I'm going to take a container, fill that up a little bit, pour that on the inside, roll that around in there. So if it doesn't quite get up to the top, just go ahead and roll that out, turn that over, shake it to drip out the excess there. Okay? So you can see we've got a little glaze on the outside, and that's actually kind of good because we can show how to clean that up. Let's take a large sponge here, nice and clean. I'm just going to go ahead and sponge that right off. Actually, that'll look pretty nice with the clear glaze over it. Maybe I'll get a little blue in my lines there. So I'm just kind of swiftly taking that off. You need to be very clean. You get in there with a really clean brush and get more detailed about brushing that off there. Clean it off. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and let that kind of dry like that. I like that effect. Look interesting with my contrasting clay design. I'm being very careful not to splash glaze on anybody else's piece here. Okay, so while that's drying, I can go back and work on my other first piece here. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in the peacock blue so I can see what that is going to look like on the outside of a piece. And this piece is good because I've kind of got this lip on the bottom here that I can just hold my piece and plunge that in there. And I'm just going to do that for a second or two, okay? Just go ahead, push straight down so you get a bubble of air in the inside chamber there, and make sure you bring that out just after a second or two. Don't let it sit in there for 5 seconds. You get way too much glaze on there. So go ahead and shake that. Get the excess drips off of there. Okay. So we're going to go ahead. I can lift that by putting my hand on the inside since it's nice and dry. Just let that sit to the side there and let that dry. Okay. I'm going to take this clear glaze. Make sure I've got, okay, so this is our clear glaze right here. It's easy to get that mixed up with the white, so make sure you check the side. They've got the names on there that says Cone 10 Clear on there. To give that a stir with a new clean stick. Remember, do not use stick from another glaze to stir up a new glaze. Otherwise, you'll contaminate the glaze buckets. Okay. This one, the inside's pretty dry, the outside's dry. I'm not going to contaminate that clear glaze with wet glaze. Okay. So this one, I do not have a lip on there, so I'm just going to hold that with my fingers. Okay. So there will be some voids in the glaze where my fingers are, but we'll touch those up in a little bit with a brush. Okay. But first, we're going to just dip that in there. We want to, again, make sure that we leave 1/4 of an inch, so don't plunge the whole thing in there. We do not want easy glaze on the bottom. And we want to leave a space of about 1/4 of an inch that the glaze will not be on, okay? So I'm just going to go down like that, nice and quick, bring that out, okay? Shake off the excess. Okay, I'm going to put my hand on the inside there. Use that to transfer that to the table. Okay, so I did go a little below the level of where I wanted to go. So we will fix that in a second. Okay, so we'll let those dry so I will be able to touch those. Okay, so we've been using some gloves here. Those will be provided mostly for COVID, so we're not transferring germs, but it's also nice just so you kind of keep your hands clean. I don't know how fussy you are, but there's nothing poisonous in the glazes. Don't worry about that. A couple of pieces here drying. Okay, so we've got our piece here that we dipped in glaze, and I didn't quite nail it on the dismount there. So I've got more glaze here around the bottom that I want, and I've got these little pieces of the peacock colored glaze that are peeking in under the bottom there. We want to make sure this bottom part is completely dry, and we want to make sure that we have 1/4 of an inch at least of space here. So I have not done both of those very well. So I'm going to take a nice clean sponge. I'm going to take my piece here, and I'm going to twist it just like this on the sponge. Nice big cleanup sponge here. I can just press that into the sponge. That simultaneously cleans off the blubs and smears of glaze that we don't want on the bottom there. It also moves the line of that base of the glaze there upwards. So that will give us the tolerance of space there that we need. Make sure have any glaze that will drip down. Okay, I've got a nice thin layer there. I do have a few finger marks here from where I held onto it when I was dipping that in there. So I am going to take a little clear glaze and I am just going to touch those up. You do not want to dip those again because you do not want to make the glaze too thick. So you can take a little brush. You can even just kind of take your finger and you're just going to touch those up just a little bit. Okay, just dab a few spots on there. It's like you're dabbing a little makeup or perfume on there. So if you can see any of your bisque kind of peeking through a little bit, you want to make sure that you cover that up with some glaze. So you can see that pink of the bisque peeking through in a few areas where I touched that when I was dipping. Just touch it up in that area. I just spot it a few times to kind of blend it with the other pieces there. Okay, so if you do see some clay coming through, that means that it's kind of thin and you'll see more of the rough texture of your clay come through after it's fired. So you don't want any little rough spots here. So I'm just dabbing those on there though. Everywhere else though, I've got pretty good coverage. Touch it up a little bit there. Okay. It doesn't really hurt anything. It just means that you'll have surface on your piece that's a little rougher looking than the rest of the piece. So you might want that a little more consistent. Okay, so we're going to do one more here with a piece that's a little larger than what we might be able to hold on to. So I've got my Udu piece here, and I've got a pair of tongs. So we're going to dip that in the clear. I'm going to use the tongs on there to get a good grip on there. Hold it like this. So we're going to hold it like this. The tongs are going to hold that up. Okay, so keep a good grip on there. I'm going to dip that down, use the tongs, and then quickly bring that out, shake that off. Good to do with a piece that's too large for you to hold on to with your hands. Okay. So we've got a few little areas there where we do have some voids where I had my hand. So I'm actually going to take a little excess. Just dab that on there. Here, so be prepared for all kinds of weather here on the hill. So I'm sorry for having sound or visual effects that are not great. We'll try our best here. Okay. It's looking pretty good. I didn't get any glaze on the bottom there, so I'm going to call that done and let that dry. And then you're going to leave those. Make sure that you've got your tools cleaned up, you've got your areas sponged, anything that you used, you want to make sure you clean up. And then last but not least, you want to make sure that you record what you did. So I have 2 mugs that I made. And do a little drawing of each of those. And be spectacular. Just enough for you to be able to recognize which was which. I've got my Udu here. Okay. So this one I've got black on the inside, peacock blue on the outside, cone 10. I've got peacock blue on the inside, clear outside, 10. Outside. Okay. Once again, we've got peacock And I let that drip down a little bit, so I'll see what the interaction is. Hi. Getting these back in a week or two, hopefully, and you'll be able to pick them up and see the results.